Welcome to the Folktale Project. This is Dan Scholz. Today we have a story about goblins. That much is plain from the title. But this is not a story of being mischievous on their part, or of any damages done. In fact, we've all heard stories in every place around the world, and if you look back at the stories that the Folktale Project has shared, you'll find many of elves and goblins and other creatures of fairy tales. And all of our stories share one thing, that they did once live and walk amongst us. And this story tells us why, at least in Cologne, they no longer do. This is the Goblins. This story goes back to the good old times, of which we modern people always speak with a great sigh of regret. It was then when good-natured goblins appeared to mortalize and tried to render the life of the troubled human race a little more cheerful. In groves and dens they had magnificent dwellings and watched there over the enormous mineral treasures of the earth. Often, these beneficent elves were busy miners or sometimes clever artisans. We all know that they manufactured the precious trinkets and arms of the Nibelungen treasure. Deep in the interior of the earth, they lived happily together, ruled over by a king. They could be called the harmless friends of darkness because they were not allowed to come into broad daylight. If they did so, they were transformed into stones. The goblins did not always remain underground. On the contrary, they often came to the earth's surface through certain holes called goblin holes, but they always avoided meeting man. Alas, the advance of civilization has driven these friendly spirits gradually from the places where they used to do so much good. None of us, I am sure, has ever had the good luck of meeting one of them. The goblins were of different sizes. Sometimes they were as small as one's thumb, sometimes as large as the hand of a child of 4 years old. The most remarkable feature of these tiny figures was the enormous head and the pointed hump that so often adorned their backs. Their look was on the whole more comical than ugly. German people used to call them Heinzchen or Heinzelmannchen. A long time ago, the good town of Cologne was inhabited by a host of dwarfs, and the honest population knew a great many stories about them. The workmen and artisans especially had, through the assistance of these little wights, far more holidays than are marked in the calendar. When the carpenters, for instance, were lying on their benches in sweet repose, these little men came swiftly and stealthily along. They took up the tools and chiseled and sawed and hammered with a will, and thus, records the poetical chronicles which I am quoting, before the carpenters woke up, the house stood there finished. In the same way things went on with the baker. While his lads were snoring, the little goblin came to help. They groaned under the load of heavy corn sacks, they kneaded and weighed the flour, lifted and pushed the bread into the oven, and before the lazy bakers opened their eyes, the morning bread, brown and crisp, was lying in rows on the table. The butchers, too, could speak of similar agreeable experiences. The good little men chopped, mixed, and stirred with all their might, and when the drowsy butcher opened his eyes at last, he found the fresh, steaming sausages adorning the walls of his shop. The cooper enjoyed also the help of the busy dwarfs, and even the tailor could not complain of the goblins having neglected him. Once, Mr. Cotton, a clever tailor, had the honor of making a Sunday coat for the mayor of the town. He worked diligently at it, but you can easily imagine that in the heat of the summer afternoon the needle soon dropped from his hand, and he fell fast asleep. Hush! Look there! One little goblin after the other crept cautiously from his hiding-place. They climbed on the table and began the tailor's work, and stitched and sewed and fitted and pressed as if they had been masters of the needle all their lives. When Master Cotton awoke, he found to his great joy the mayor's Sunday coat ready-made, and so neatly and well done that he could present the magnificent garment with pride to the head of the town. The pretty wife of Mr. Cotton looked at this masterpiece of her husband's art with a mischievous twinkle in her eyes. In the night, when her husband had fallen asleep, she rose from her bed, and without making the slightest noise, she scattered peas all over the floor of the workshop. Then she put a half-finished suit on the table. She kept a small lantern hidden under her apron and waited beside the door listening. Soon after, the room was full of little men, all tumbling, falling, and slipping over the peas. Yells and screams rose at the same time. The poor little men were indeed much bruised and hurt. Without stopping, they ran downstairs and disappeared. The tailor's wife heard the noise and thought it good sport. When the yells were loudest, she suddenly opened the door to see her visitors, but she came too late. Not a single goblin was left behind. Since that time, the friendly dwarfs have never more been seen in Cologne, and in other places also. They have entirely disappeared. And that is the story of the goblins, and of Mrs. Cotton, who chased them all away just for a bit of sport. This is Dan Scholz for the Folktale Project. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, anywhere you like to get your podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter at Folktale Project. You can find us on Auto Radio, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, anywhere you'd like to listen. And you can always head over to folktaleproject.com, where you'll find a new story waiting for you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. As always, thank you so much for listening.